and no one moves a limb, a muscle, when Camilla passes. And that was because they were angry with Camilla. They were furious. And not only that, Kate and William were angry too. And that anger, of course, Harry was angry, that anger went right through that small part of the congregation.
Charles has always been known for his devotion to family, but nothing compares to the drastic step he took against Queen Camilla. Inside the palace, he was handed a set of private papers, and what he read left him stunned. Camilla had removed Prince Louis and Princess Charlotte from his will, and what followed ended with her being kicked out in a way no one ever saw coming. So, stay with us as we uncover the full story of what happened inside the palace. The morning sun streamed gently through the tall windows of Buckingham Palace, and King Charles sat in a private study, surrounded by portraits of monarchs who had ruled before him. Their painted eyes seemed to follow him with a stern watchfulness. But Charles's gaze lingered on two portraits in particular. One was Queen Victoria, whose reign had shaped an entire era, and the other was his grandmother, Queen Mary, who had been known for her unwavering devotion to tradition. As he studied their faces with unusual intensity, he noticed something unexpected on his desk. It was a sealed envelope that was cream-colored and marked only with an official wax seal, and it had been delivered to him that morning. Charles looked at it curiously, but with a faint unease, for envelopes like this usually carried weighty matters. He did not yet know that within it lay words that would ignite fury, betrayal, and a scandal powerful enough to shake the monarchy itself. Keep watching to find out what happened next. He reached for the envelope slowly, his hands steady on the outside but restless within. The wax seal cracked as he broke it, and the paper slid free into his palm. The parchment was thick, smooth, and formal, the sort used only for the most serious matters. As he unfolded it, his eyes landed instantly on the heading, which stated, "Amendments to the last will and testament of His Majesty, King Charles III." Charles blinked, his breath hitching for a moment. Amendments? He had not asked for any changes. His eyes moved faster now, scanning the page line by line, and then he froze. His pulse jumped. Two names, which he holds dearest to his heart, were missing, and these were Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis. The space where their names should have been was gone, clean, erased. At that moment, his heart began to pound harder. He read the words again, once, twice, even a third time, hoping the letters would rearrange themselves into something else, but they did not. The truth stayed sharp and cold on the page. The document stated clearly that his grandchildren, Charlotte and Louis, would no longer be direct beneficiaries of his will. A slow and unsettling wave of disbelief swept over him, and his fingers shook slightly as he continued reading further down the page. Then his eyes drifted downward toward the signature line, and there, in neat black ink, he found words that were not his own. What he saw was a handwritten message addressed to the royal lawyers, and it was brief yet carried a meaning that could not be ignored. The note read, "Proceed with this adjustment as discussed," and the final stroke of the pen left no room for doubt. The handwriting was instantly recognizable, and it carried the familiar shape and flow he had seen many times before. It was Camilla's, clear and undeniable, and the realization cut through him with the weight of betrayal. For a moment, he could not think clearly. He could only feel the sting of betrayal. He lifted his eyes to the portrait of Queen Mary on the wall. Her stern expression seemed sharper now, as if watching him with disappointment. He thought of Queen Victoria, who had ruled with such strength, and he asked himself what she would have thought of this. Would she have allowed her legacy to be reshaped in secrecy? Would she have forgiven such bold interference? As fury rose within him, another thought cut even deeper. This was not just about heritage or money, it was about children. innocent children. Charlotte, who had once sat on his lap asking endless questions about the jewels in the crown. Louis, who had run to him with arms wide open, laughing without a care. What could they possibly have done to deserve this? To have their names wiped away as if they had no place in his legacy? The idea made his jaw tighten. But then, as his anger grew sharper, memory pulled him backward. He recalled little comments Camilla had made in the past, ones he had brushed aside at the time. It was a rainy afternoon months ago, when they had been sitting in his study with the fire crackling. She had spoken lightly, almost as though making casual conversation. "It might be wise to simplify things, Charles," she said. "Too many hands weaken the structure." He had looked at her then with only mild interest. He thought she meant reducing unnecessary expenses, trimming ceremonies, and cutting costs. He dismissed it with a nod, promising to revisit it later, but never did. Another time, over dinner, she had said again, "William's children will always be provided for. Some of them will inherit titles and estates. Perhaps not all need the same share." He remembered, frowning slightly, but he let it go because he was tired and he did not wish to argue. Now those passing remarks stood before him in flesh, embodied in the paper he held. They were no longer harmless comments. They had been seeds planted carefully, quietly, and now they had grown into something much darker. The silence of the room pressed harder on him, and he whispered to himself, "Why?" The answer did not come. Only the clock ticked on, counting down seconds that felt unbearably heavy. Charles lowered himself back into his chair, the paper spread on the table before him. His fingers splayed across it as if by holding it down he could somehow keep the truth from escaping. But the betrayal was alive and burning. It was not only the action itself, but the secrecy that made it worse. To know that Camilla had gone directly to the legal office without his knowledge, without his consent, it was more than arrogance. It was a rewriting of history. Camilla's own mind, however, saw things differently. In recent months, she had been reading about queens who had influenced kings from behind the throne, women who were remembered not only as consorts, but as architects of dynasties. She admired those who had acted boldly when the crown seemed at risk. She began to see herself in that line of powerful women, the kind who shaped destiny with a steady hand. In her eyes, this adjustment was not betrayal. It was protection. She believed the monarchy faced uncertain times and that concentrating resources would strengthen it. But Charles could not see it that way. To him, it was not a question of practicality. It was a question of love, of family, and of honor. Removing Charlotte and Louis was not streamlining. It was erasing. It was not wisdom. It was cruelty. He rose to his feet once more, pacing the length of the study, his robe trailing slightly behind him. His eyes flicked again to the portrait of Queen Mary, whose gazes remained stern and unyielding. He felt her presence like a weight on his shoulders, as if she was urging him not to let this go. The betrayal burned deeper now because this was not the act of an enemy, but of his wife, the woman meant to share his burden. She had crossed a line that could not be undone with soft words. He felt anger, like he had not felt in years, a fire that was both kingly and personal. At last, he rang the small bell at his desk. A servant entered quietly, bowing, waiting for instructions. Charles's voice was calm but carried a steel edge. "Bring Queen Camilla to me." The servant nodded and slipped out of the room, leaving Charles alone once more with the heavy envelope on the table. He stood there, staring down at it, his fists tightening at his sides. He knew this was not going to be a gentle conversation. It was going to be a reckoning. Because at its heart, this was more than a disagreement. This was a clash between two visions of the crown. For Charles, history was a guide that must be honored. For Camilla, history was a tool that could be bent to secure survival. These two visions were about to collide. The golden quiet of that morning had been shattered. What had begun with sunlight streaming softly through palace windows was about to explode into a storm. A storm that would not only test their marriage, but also shake the very idea of what it meant to be royal. So stay tuned as we delve into what happened when Camilla finally entered that room. When Camilla walked into the room slowly, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who believed she had done nothing wrong. She was dressed in a dark outfit that gave her an air of authority, and her steps were steady, almost rehearsed, as if she had prepared for this moment long before it came. Charles was already waiting for her, and he stood near the tall windows, his back straight and his hands clasped behind him. The golden light of the late afternoon stretched across the room, but the warmth of it did nothing to soften the cold silence that hung between them. He looked at her, not with the eyes of a husband, but with the eyes of a man who had been betrayed. His expression was firm and his jaw was tight, and although he wanted to hear her explanation, he already feared what her answer would be. When he finally asked if she had really tried to cut Prince Louis and Princess Charlotte out of the will, Camilla did not hesitate. She admitted it, and she did so calmly, almost as if she believed her reasoning would clear her of any blame. Her voice was steady, and it carried no hint of apology. Instead, she began to speak with the tone of someone who was giving a lecture, as if the matter was not personal but part of a greater truth. She explained that she'd acted out of duty, not malice, and she leaned on history to defend herself. She spoke of past queens who had faced difficult times and who had made decisions that were painful but necessary. She mentioned Queen Mary and reminded Charles of how she had secured the line of succession during times of turmoil. Camilla claimed that strong queens had always been willing to make hard choices, and she believed she was walking in that same tradition. According to her, the monarchy could not afford to be softened by sentiment, because sentiment had a way of weakening its very foundation. She argued that the crown had survived for centuries because rulers placed duty above personal feelings. And as she spoke, she made it clear that she thought Charles was too gentle and too sentimental to do what was needed. In her eyes, she was not betraying him, but protecting the crown. For a few moments, her words seemed to hang in the room like a heavy curtain. Charles listened closely, and he could not deny that history was filled with stories of rulers who had chosen duty over affection. Yet the more she spoke, the more his heart twisted. He felt that she was using history not as a guide, but as a weapon. And when he finally spoke, his voice was sharp, with both sorrow and anger. Yes, history remembers those queens, Charles said, his voice low but cutting, but it also remembers the times they lived in. That was an age when kings and queens ruled with absolute power, and survival often demanded sacrifice. We do not live in that world anymore. Camilla did not reply at once. She stood with her hands folded in front of her, her expression unchanged, but Charles pressed on because he could not hold back the storm inside him. He told her that the monarchy survived today not through fear or ruthless choices, but through trust and unity. And he reminded her that they were not rulers who acted alone anymore. They were figureheads who represented the people, and they were judged not only by history but by the eyes of the world. And then he struck at the wound that cut the deepest. He told her that those queens she admired had acted alongside their monarchs, not against them. And even when their choices were hard, they were not done in secret. Camilla had not consulted him, and she had not given him a chance to speak as the king. Instead, she had made the decision on her own, and she had done so behind his back. To Charles, this was not duty. It was betrayal. He turned his face toward the gardens outside, trying to steady himself. But the falling autumn leaves gave him no comfort. The sight of their gentle drift only made the storm in his chest feel louder. He had spent a lifetime learning how to carry the weight of the crown, and he had always believed that those closest to him would never undermine that burden. But now, the one person he trusted most had gone behind him, and the betrayal felt almost unbearable. Camilla held her ground. She believed Charles was blinded by love for his grandchildren, and she believed his affection would lead the monarchy into weakness. In her mind, she had done what was necessary, and she did not allow his words to sway her. She said quietly, "You are thinking as a grandfather, not as a king." Her words pierced him more deeply than she could have imagined, because they reduced his love for Louis and Charlotte to nothing more than sentiment. For Charles, that love was not weakness, it was humanity. And humanity was what kept the monarchy alive in a world that no longer bowed to crowns and thrones. The argument was no longer about the will. It had grown into something far greater. It was now about the nature of their roles, about the limits of power, and about the very soul of the monarchy they represented. Charles felt that she had mistaken ambition for duty, and she had mistaken secrecy for strength. His voice rose, and the calmness that had held him back until now shattered. "You did not act as a queen who supports her king," he said fiercely. "You acted as a consort who thought she could rule in his place." Camilla did not flinch. Her eyes remained steady, but her silence spoke louder than words. Charles saw that her silence was not about remorse, but defiance, and that only deepened his rage. The air in the room grew heavier, and the walls seemed to close in as the confrontation reached its peak. For Charles, this was the breaking point. He realized that this was not a misunderstanding that could be forgiven. It was a choice she had made with clear intent, and it was a choice that had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. His voice was louder now, and it carried both pain and finality. "You have betrayed me," he declared, "and you have betrayed this family. What you have done is unforgivable, and I will not allow you to remain by my side." The silence that followed was crushing. Camilla did not argue, and she did not beg. She stood firm in her belief, but she also knew that her conviction had cost her everything. Charles had drawn the line, and he had done so with no room for return. When she finally turned and walked away, her steps were as steady as they had been when she arrived, yet the weight of her decision hung in the air like a shadow that would never lift. Charles remained by the window, and though the autumn garden was still beautiful, it no longer brought him peace. He was left standing alone, a king with the crown on his head, but a man who had just lost the one he had once trusted most. The room was silent, but the echoes of their confrontation would linger for far longer than the fading light of that day. But here's the most intriguing part. Camilla's departure from the palace was not grand, and it carried no ceremony or farewell. She left quietly, and the silence that followed her footsteps seemed to echo louder than any sound. Charles did not call the courtiers, and there was no official statement made. It was simply the end of her presence at the heart of the royal household. She walked out with her head held high, not in shame, but in a kind of pride, because in her own mind, she believed she had done what history demanded of her. She thought of herself as a woman who had tried to carry the burden of the monarchy in ways others could not understand. As the doors closed behind her, she told herself that time would eventually prove her right. She thought of Queen Margaret of Anjou, the powerful wife of Henry VI, who had been painted by history as ambitious and overreaching, yet who had fought fiercely to protect her crown. Camilla saw in that story a reflection of her own, and she imagined that she too was being punished, not because she was wrong, but because she was strong in a world that resisted women who wielded power. But while she left with that thought, the palace itself was gripped by a different silence. Charles stood in his private study, still holding the documents that had revealed the betrayal, and though he had made his decision firmly, the weight of it pressed heavily upon him. He knew the world outside those walls would soon know of what had happened, and he also knew that once the news escaped, it would no longer belong to him. It would belong to the press, to the commentators, and to the countless voices eager to shape the story into whatever version suited them best. It did not take long. Within days, whispers began to reach the newspapers, and the headlines soon followed. The press did not have the full truth, but they had just enough to craft their narratives. Some papers reported the story as if it were nothing more than a family quarrel, suggesting that Camilla had disagreed with Charles over inheritance matters and that the king had reacted strongly. Other outlets, however, hinted at something deeper. They spoke of a queen consort who had tried to reshape the will of a monarch and who had been banished from his side as a result. And a few, likely with sources sympathetic to Camilla, drew parallels with history itself, subtly weaving in references to queens who had dared to challenge kings. "Palace rift over king's will," one headline declared. Another asked, "Has Queen Camilla overstepped?" The speculation grew each day, and the royal family found themselves once again at the center of a storm. For Charles, the storm was personal, but for the monarchy, it was political. The people had always watched the royals closely, but moments of scandal drew eyes with greater intensity. Every word in the papers was analyzed, every photograph was examined for hidden meaning, and every action by Charles or William was seen as a signal of where the monarchy stood. William soon came to see his father, and when Charles placed the documents in his hands, the weight of them was clear. William read them carefully, and as his eyes moved over the lines where Louis and Charlotte's names had been removed, his expression hardened. He listened as Charles explained Camilla's defense, how she had leaned on history and compared herself to queens who had made difficult choices. William was furious, not only at the act itself, but at the arrogance behind it. He saw no nobility in Camilla's reasoning, only an attempt to use history as a mask for something petty and destructive. To him, comparing herself to the great queens of the past was not an act of wisdom, but one of vanity. He told his father that such actions, if left unchallenged, would set a precedent that could never be undone. "She wanted to erase them, father," William said firmly, "and if she could do this in secret once, what would stop her from trying again? This is not duty. This is ambition." Charles nodded. He had already known this, but hearing it in William's voice gave it greater weight. In that moment, father and son stood united, not only against Camilla's action, but in their determination to protect the monarchy from further harm. They both understood that the institution survived not because of ruthless calculations, but because of the trust it represented. And at the center of that trust were the children, the heirs of the future, whose security could not be sacrificed for the ambitions of one consort. As the media storm grew, Camilla's allies whispered her version of events into the ears of sympathetic journalists. They painted her not as a betrayer, but as a woman misunderstood, a consort who had been punished for trying to act in the monarchy's best interest. Some of the commentary compared her to powerful women from the past, and though those comparisons gave her some comfort, they also deepened the rift between her and the royal household. Charles, however, would not bend. When the time came for their final meeting, there was no hope of reconciliation left. Camilla tried one last time to reach him, and she spoke not with the calm authority of history, but with the softer tone of their shared past. She reminded him of the years they had spent together, the struggles they had endured to be accepted, and the devotion she had given him through it all. She appealed to him not as a queen consort, but as the woman who had once been his greatest companion. Charles listened, and for a moment, his heart wavered. But he knew the truth could not be ignored. He told her that he respected her ambition, but ambition alone did not make her actions right. He explained that by cutting Louis and Charlotte from the will, she had not only acted in secrecy, but had also tried to alter the very heart of the monarchy. He said quietly, "You chose the wrong path, and the crown cannot walk with you any longer." Those words ended what little hope remained. Camilla left with the knowledge that she had lost not just her place beside him, but also her role in the future of the monarchy. She had once believed that history would vindicate her, but now she faced the reality that history might remember her only for this moment of betrayal. Charles, meanwhile, turned his focus to the future. He and William began to work side by side, and together they presented a united front. The world soon saw them with Prince Louis and Princess Charlotte, walking together in public, smiling and speaking to crowds, making it clear that the children were beloved and secure. The photographs of those appearances spoke louder than any words, and they sent a message that the monarchy was strong, not because of cold, calculated decisions, but because of family and unity. Behind palace walls, Charles reflected often on the portraits that lined his private rooms. He looked at the faces of Queen Victoria and Queen Mary, and he thought of the choices they had made in their own times. He also understood that he lived in a different world, one where the survival of the monarchy depended less on ruthless decisions and more on compassion and integrity. He had chosen to stand by his grandchildren, and in doing so, he believed he had chosen the right path. He told himself that the monarchy could not be left to the political games of a consort, no matter how well-meaning that consort believed herself to be. It had to remain anchored in the authority of the monarch, guided by love for family and by loyalty to the people it served. That was the legacy he wanted to leave behind, and that was the precedent he hoped William would carry forward. So, do you think King Charles was right to banish Camilla after discovering her attempt to alter the will? Or do you believe history will judge her differently, perhaps even vindicating her actions one day? Drop it in the comment section below. If you enjoyed watching this video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.